today is from Vietnamese Zen Buddhist monk, author, and peace activist Thich Nhat Hanh. Before his death in 2022, Thich Nhat Hanh was regarded as one of the most profound and widely known voices for compassion, peace, and understanding in the world. In 1967, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. nominated him for the Nobel Peace Prize for his outspoken activism against the Vietnam War. Hear these words from this wise teacher. The Sanskrit word ahimsa, usually translated nonviolence, literally means non-harming or harmlessness. To practice ahimsa, first of all, we have to practice it within ourselves. In each of us, there is a certain amount of violence and a certain amount of nonviolence. Depending on our state of being, our response to things will be more or less violent. Even if we take pride in being vegetarian, for example, we have to acknowledge that the water in which we boil our vegetables contains many tiny microorganisms. We cannot be completely nonviolent, but by being vegetarian, we are going in the direction of nonviolence. If we want to head north, we can use the North Star to guide us, but it is impossible to arrive at the North Star. Our effort is only to proceed in that direction. Anyone can practice some nonviolence, even soldiers. Some army generals, for example, conduct their operations in ways that avoid killing innocent people. This is a kind of nonviolence. To help soldiers move in that nonviolent direction, we have to be in touch with them. If we divide reality into two camps, the violent and the nonviolent, and stand in one camp while attacking the other, the world will never have peace. We will always blame and condemn those we feel are responsible for wars and social injustice, without recognizing the degree of violence in ourselves. We must work on ourselves and also work with those we condemn if we want to have a real impact.
Our ancient lesson today comes from the Christian Gospel according to Matthew. This passage on nonviolence comes from Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, widely considered to be the clearest distillation of Jesus' ethical and spiritual teachings. This is Matthew 5:38 through 48. You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist an evildoer, but if someone strikes you on the right cheek, turn the other also. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, give your coat as well. And if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go also the 2nd mile. Give to the one who asks of you, and do not refuse anyone who wants to borrow from you. You have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be children of your Father in heaven. For he makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. For if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? And if you greet only your brothers and sisters, what more are you doing than others? Do not even the Gentiles do the same? Be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect.
Would you pause with me in prayer and offer a moment of gratitude for the wise teachers from so many corners and so many traditions. Open our hearts, guiding Spirit speaking among us today. Amen. Now, I know not everyone here is a Jesus person, but I'm willing to bet that just about everyone here has heard at least some part of that gospel reading. An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Turn the other cheek, go the extra mile, love your enemies. There are some parts of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount that have become so central to the broader cultural context that they get repeated by people who have probably never heard them in a church service or in context. In the absence of context, that eye for an eye piece often gets misinterpreted. Some people just quote it as justification for revenge, which is clearly not the interpretation Jesus has in mind. Jesus here is building on the ancient law, commonly known as lex talionis in Latin, the law of exact reciprocal retaliation. But what many don't understand is that the purpose of that law was actually restraint. It was rooted in the belief that retaliation or restitution should never go beyond the original offense. It actually comes from a much earlier source, from the Hammurabi Code, which certainly informed the ancient Hebrew laws. The idea was that when you can make someone whole, that's what you do. If your cow gores and kills somebody else's cow, you give them your cow. When you cannot, when there is no way to make them whole and somebody decides there should be punishment, the punishment must never be disproportionate. It is more of an ethical parable than it is an actual law. This was meant to prevent the hideous, endless cycles of revenge that develop when feuds are allowed to grow over time. If you've ever worked with groups of youth in like a summer camp context, and you've ever seen a prank war, you've seen how this happens. It just escalates and escalates and escalates until somebody intervenes to stop it. Jesus, however, takes this a step farther. And this is one of those lines that is squarely in the middle of some of the most well-known scriptures in the New Testament, ones that are known by Christians as well as folks who are not Christians. And yet, somehow, it gets by almost everyone. It got by me until I was in seminary and someone pointed it out. Do not resist an evil doer. That is a challenging line. Do not resist an evildoer. I think Jesus and Thich Nhat Hanh would have gotten along really well. I think Thich Nhat Hanh has said as much. I firmly believe that people who really dig into their faith traditions, whatever faith it is, wind up much closer to one another than they do to folks in their own faith. There's a reason people like Thich Nhat Hanh, Martin Luther King Jr., and Gandhi find affinity with one another, even as many within their own faith communities grow suspicious of them, even label them heretics. Do not resist an evildoer sounds kind of like resignation, doesn't it? For those of us who are social justice minded, resisting when people are doing evil is exactly what we feel called to do. When we see something in the world that is unjust, we want to challenge it, resist it, and change it. Thich Nhat Hanh's reflection on the Buddhist principle of ahimsa might give us some clue as to how to interpret what seems to be, what could seem to be, Jesus' call to inaction. Ahimsa is the principle of doing no harm. Coming from Indian moral philosophy, it's shared by Hindus, Jains, Sikhs, and Buddhists. As Thich Nhat Hanh explains, it is a guiding star, one that we likely never arrive at. We often talk about Jesus' moral teachings in the gospel like that too. They're a little too pure and perfect for us to ever really live out. We exist in complicated relationship to all things, and so by virtue just of existing, we are causing harm to something. Every step we take crushes grass or insects or even just little microorganisms. But we can continue to raise our awareness and our consciousness to open our hearts and minds to the ways that we know we harm other living beings. And we can and should do something to change that. When our eyes are opened to harm, to injustice, when we see people harming others or the planet, there's an impulse in us to seek justice, to resist that evil, to stop the harm being done. I think Thich Nhat Hanh would certainly recognize this as our duty to move in the direction of nonviolence, non-harming. And despite his words, do not resist an evildoer, I have to believe that Jesus would also allow some variance for the protection of the love of our neighbor. What I believe Jesus is cautioning against here when he says do not resist an evildoer is precisely what I see Thich Nhat Hanh naming in very clear language. Quote, if we divide reality into two camps, the violent and the nonviolent, and stand in one camp while attacking the other, the world will never have peace. We will always blame and condemn those who we feel are responsible for wars and social injustice without recognizing the degree of violence within ourselves. End quote. As people passionate for justice, it is easy for us to get swept up into the highly charged moral absolutism that seems to be in fashion these days. It seems like in more and more areas in our lives, we're being asked to dig into our respective bunkers and join in lobbing insults and scorn at one another. And in a world where misinformation seems to have supplanted information, in which there is more profit to be made from lies than from the truth, there often feels like there is a gulf between how we think about the world. I hear sound bites and read quotes from people. Sometimes I cannot make sense of it. I think a lot of the people who I disagree with are actually talking nonsense. Some of you probably feel that way too. I think we're entitled to our feelings on that. Sometimes the most radical things, however, are the things that seem the simplest. Radical, as many of you know, refers to the root. To do something radical is to go back and change something at the very root. Jesus and Thich Nhat Hanh were radicals in that way, calling us back to the very heart of what it means to live and breathe and exist in a human body. I believe both in their own ways invite us to open our hearts, challenge us to open our hearts. I love that chant that we started with by Ana Hernandez. It is so simple and yet so profound. Opening our hearts does not mean glossing over injustice. It doesn't mean that we have to accept someone's false narrative or information. It doesn't mean that we have to agree to disagree. It doesn't mean that we have to love and accept every person's way of being, the way that everyone behaves and harms people in some depoliticized way. That's not what I'm getting at. opening our hearts means more than that. First, it means looking honestly at what is in our own hearts. What are the hurts that we need to have healed? Where is the pain within us? How does it impact how we see and engage with the world? It begins with a kind of open heart surgery on ourselves to really take a look at what's in there. It also means engaging the world with compassion, not just with our opinions and ideas. Compassion means to feel with. It can be really hard to think with some of the people we disagree with. Again, some of the thinking out there is nonsensical. But if we listen to some of that, what to us sounds like nonsense, and it may be nonsense, we start to understand that there is behind the opinion, the position, the vote, the politics, a heart that needs healing, much like our own. Opening our hearts is vulnerable. Sometimes it isn't even safe. There are people who will hurt us if we do that, and sometimes we need to keep ourselves closed up. That's why boundaries exist. But if peace is our vision for the world, and I believe that is the vision of Thich Nhat Hanh and Jesus and countless others, then we must be willing to open our hearts to the world at some point. We must be willing to engage with the world not just on a thinking level, but on an emotional level as well, on a visceral level even. We must open our hearts to the fact that violence springs from deeply wounded hearts that have closed themselves off. Violence and war are the places we go when we are no longer willing to look inside ourselves because we can't stomach looking at any more pain. Violence is what we are willing to do to someone we believe is an evil doer. And often, what we are willing to do in resisting evil brings us right back into the cycle of violence and injustice. This spring, many of you will probably plant gardens. I hope many of you will plant gardens. You'll break up the topsoil, turn it over. You'll probably pull some weeds. You might find a few rocks in there. Then after the hard work of turning and tilling, you'll put seeds into that freshly broken open earth, seeds that will surely grow. Our hearts are like that too. We have to open them up. We have to let them break a little bit with the world sometimes. We have to churn and turn and till them. Sometimes we have to dredge up some really weird, sad stuff. But we have to do that before they are truly ready for seeds of peace, justice, and love. May we open our hearts.